Welcome to Storytime with Snaggy Wolf, where the moonlight meets microphone and every tale glows with a spark of magic. I'm your host, Snaggy Wolf, headphones on, mic hot, and ready to guide you through stories that stir the soul, tickle the imagination, and sometimes howl at the moon. So take a seat on the log by the fire, let the fireflies dance, and settle in for a journey through legends, mysteries, and midnight musings. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join the pack, because every story is better when it's shared. The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood. Chapter 1. A considerable number of hunting parties were out that year without finding so much as a fresh trail, for the moose were uncommonly shy, and the various Nimrods returning to the bosoms of their respective families with the best excuses the facts of their imagination could suggest. Dr. Cathcart, among others, came back without a trophy, but he brought, instead, the memory of an experience which, he declares, was worth all the bull moose that have ever been shot. But then Cathcart, of Aberdeen, was interested in other things besides moose. Amongst them was the human mind. This particular story, however, found no mention in his book on collective hallucination for the simple reason, so he confided once to his fellow colleague, that he himself played too intimate a part in it to form a complete judgment of the affair as a whole. Besides himself and his guide Hank Davies, there was a young Simpson, his nephew, a divinity student destined for Weekirk, then on his first visit to the Canadian backwoods, and the latter's guide, Defago. Joseph Defago was a French Canuck who had strayed from his native province of Quebec years before, and had caught in Red Portage when the Canadian Pacific Railway was building. A man who, in addition to his unparalleled knowledge of woodcraft and bush lore, could also sing the old voyager songs and tell capital hunting yarn into a bargain. He was deeply susceptible, moreover, to the singular spell which the wilderness lays upon certain lonely natures, and he found the wild solitudes with a kind of romantic passion that amounted almost to an obsession. The life of the backwoods fascinated him, whence, doubtless, his surpassing efficiency in dealing with their mysteries. On this particular expedition he was Hank's choice. Hank knew him, swore by him, he also swore at him, just as a pal might, and since he had the vocabulary of a picturesque, if utterly meaningless oaths, the conversation between the two stalwart and hardy woodsmen was often of rather lively description. This river of expletives, however, Hank agreed to dam a little out of the respect of his old hunting boss, Dr. Cathcart, whom of course he addressed after the fashion of the country as Doc, and also because he understood that young Simpson was already a bit of a parson. He had, however, one objection to Defago, and one only, which was that the French Canadian sometimes exhibited what Hank described as the output of a cursed and dismal mind, meaning apparently that he sometimes was true to type, Latin type, and suffered fits of a kind of silent moroseness when nothing could induce him to utter to speak. Defago, that is to say, was imaginative and melancholy, and as a rule was too long a spell of civilization that induced the attacks for a few days of the wilderness invariably curbed them. This, then, was the party of four that found themselves in the camp that last week in October of that shy moose year, way up in the wilderness north of Rat Portage, a forsaken and desolate country. There was also Punk, an Indian who had accompanied Dr. Cathcart and Hank on their hunting trips in previous years, and who acted as a cook. His duty was merely to stay in camp, catch fish, and prepare venison steaks and coffee at a few minutes' notice. He dressed in the worn-out clothes bequeathed to him from former patrons, and except for his coarse black hair and dark skin, he looked in these city garments no more like a real redskin than the looks of a real African-American. For that, however, Punk had in him still the instincts of his dying race. His taciturn silence and his endurance survived, also his superstition. The party rounded the blazing fire that night were despondent, for a week had passed without a single sign of a recent moose discovering itself. Defago had sung his song and plunged into a story, but Hank, in bad humor, reminded him so often that he keep mussin' up to the face so, that it was so most all nothing, but a petered out lie, that the Frenchman had finally subsided into sulking silence, which nothing seemed likely to break. Dr. Cathcart and his nephew were fairly done after an exhausting day. Punk was washing dishes, grunting to himself under the lean-to of branches where he later also slept. No one troubled to stir the slowly dying fire. Overhead the stars were brilliant in the sky, quite wintry, and there was also a little wind that ice was already forming stealthily along the shores of the still lake behind them. The silence of the vast, listening forest stole forward and enveloped them. Hank broke in suddenly with his nasal voice. "I'm in favor of breaking new ground tomorrow, Doc," he observed with energy, looking across at his employer. "We don't stand a dead Dago's chance around here." "Agreed," said Cathcart, always a man of few words. "Think the idea's good." "Sure, Pop, it's good," Hank resumed with confidence. "S'pose now you and I strike west up Garden Lake, way for a change. None of us ain't touched that quite bit of land yet. I'm with you. And you, Defago, take Mr. Simpson along the small canoe, skip across the lake, portage over to 50 Island Water, take a good squint down their far shore. The moose yarded there the hell last year. For all we know, they may be doing it again this year, just to spite us." Defago, keeping his eyes on the fire, said nothing by the way of reply. He was still offended, possibly, about his interrupted story. "No one's been up that way this year, and I'll lay my bottom dollar on that," Hank added with emphasis, as though he had a reason for knowing. He looked over at his partner sharply. "Better take the little silk tent and stay away a couple of nights," he concluded, as though the matter were definitely settled, for Hank was recognized as the general organizer of the hunt, and in charge of the party. It was obvious to anyone that Defago did not jump at this plan, but his silence seemed to convey something more than ordinary disapproval. And across his sensitive dark face there passed a curious expression like a flash of firelight, not so quickly, however, that the three men had not time to catch it. "He funked for some reason, I thought," Simpson said afterwards in the tent he shared with his uncle. Dr. Cathcart made no immediate reply, although the look had interested him enough at the time for him to make a mental note of it. The expression had caused him a passing uneasiness he could not quite account for at the moment. But Hank, of course, had been the first to notice it, and the odd thing was instead of becoming explosive or angry over the other's reluctance, he had once began to humor a bit. "But there's no special reason why no one's up there this year," he said with a perceivable hush in his tone. "Not the reason you mean, anyway. Last year was the fires that kept folks out. This year, I guess it just happened so, that's all." His manner was clearly meant to be encouraging. Joseph Defago raised his eyes at that moment, then dropped them again. A breath of wind stole out the forest and stirred the embers into a passing blaze. Dr. Cathcart again noticed the expression in the guide's face, and again he did not like it. But this time, the nature of the look betrayed itself. In those eyes, for an instant, he caught the gleam of a man, scared in his very soul. It did quieted him more than he cared to admit. "Bad Indians up that way?" he asked with a laugh to ease matters a little, while Simpson, too sleepy to notice this subtle byplay, moved off to bed with a prestigious yawn. Or anything wrong with the country?" he added, when his nephew was out of hearing. Hank met his eye with something less than his usual frankness. "He just skeered," he replied good-humoredly. "Skeered stiff about some old fairy tale, that's all, ain't it, old pard?" And he gave Defago a friendly kick in the moccasined foot that lay nearest the fire. Defago looked up quickly, as if interrupted from Revere, however, that had not prevented his seeing all that went on about him. "Skeered nothin'," he answered, with a flush of defiance. "There's nothin' in the bush that skeered Joseph Defago, and don't you forget it." The natural energy with which he spoke made it impossible to know whether he told the whole truth, or only part of it. Hank turned towards the doctor. He was going to add something that he stopped abruptly, though, and looked round. A sound close behind them in the darkness made all three start. It was old Punk, who had moved from his lean-to while they were talking, and now stood there just beyond the circle of the firelight, listening. "'Nother time, Doc," Hank whispered with a wink, when the gallery stepped down into the stalls, and sprang to his feet. He slapped the Indian on the back and cried noisily. "Come on to the fire and warm your dirty red skin a bit." He dragged him towards the blaze and threw wood on. "That was a mighty good feed you gave us an hour or two back," he continued heartily, as though to set the man's thoughts on another scent. "And it ain't Christian to let you stand out there freezing your soul to the hell while we're getting all good and toasted." Punk moved in and warmed his feet, smiling darkly at the other's volubility, while he only half understood, but saying nothing. And presently, Dr. Cathcart, seeing that the further conversation was impossible, followed his nephew's example and moved off to the tent, leaving the three men smoking over the now blazing fire. It was not easy to undress in the small tent without waking one's companion, and Cathcart, hardened and warm-blooded as he was in spite of his 50-odd years, did what Hank would have described as considerable of his twilight in the open. He noticed, during the process, that Punk had meanwhile gone back to his lean-to, and that Hank and Defago were at it hammer and tongs, or rather hammer and anvil, the little French-Canadian being the anvil. It was very alike the conversational stage picture of a Western melodrama, the fire lighting up their faces with patches of alternative red and black, Defago in the slouch hat and moccasins, in the part of the Badlands villain, Hank, open-faced and hatless, with the reckless fling over his shoulder, the honest and deceived hero, and old Punk, eavesdropping in the background, supplying the atmosphere of mystery. The doctor smiled as he noticed these details, but at the same time something deep within him, he hardly knew what, shrank a little, as though an almost imperceptible breath of warning had touched the surface of his soul and was gone again before he could seize it. Probably it was a trace to that scared expression he had seen in the eyes of Defago. Probably, for this hint of fugitive emotion otherwise escaped his usual so keen analysis. Defago, he was vaguely aware, might cause trouble somehow. He was not as steady to guide as Hank, for instance. Further than that he could not get. He watched the men a moment longer before diving into the stuffy tent where Simpson already slept soundly. Hank, he saw, was swearing like a mad African in a New York saloon, but it was swearing of affection, the ridiculous oaths fleeing freely, now that the few causes of their obstruction was asleep. Presently, he put an arm upon his comrade's shoulder, and they moved off together in the shadows, where their tent stood faintly glimmering. Punk, too, a moment later, followed their example and disappeared between his odorous blankets in the opposite direction. Dr. Cathcart then likewise turned in, weariness and sleep still fighting in his mind with obscure curiosity to know what it was that had scared Defago about the country up in 50 Island Water. Wondering, too, why Punk's presence had prevented the completion of what Hank had to say, then sleep overtook him. He would know tomorrow. Hank would tell him the story while they trudged over after the elusive moose. Deep silence fell about the little camp. Planted there was an audaciously in the jaws of wilderness. The lake gleamed like a sheet of black glass beneath the stars. The cold air pricked, and the draughts of the night that poured their silent tide from the depths of the forest, with messages from distant ridges, and from lakes just beginning to freeze. There lay already the faint, bleak odors of coming winter. White men, with their dull scent, might never have divided from them. The fragrance of the wood fire would have concealed from them almost electrical hints of moss and bark and hardening swamp 100 miles away. Even Hank and Defago, subtle in league with the soul of woods as they are, would probably have spread their delicate nostrils in vain. But an hour later, when all slept like the dead, old Punk crept from his blankets and went down to the shore of the lake like a shadow, silently as only an Indian blood could move. He raised his head and looked about him. The thick darkness rendered sight of small avail, but like the animals, he possessed other senses that darkness could not mute. He listened, then sniffed the air. Motionless as a hemlock stem he stood there. After 5 minutes again he lifted his head and sniffed, and yet once again. A tingling of wonderful nerves that betrayed itself by no outer sign ran through him as he tasted the keen air, then merged his figure into the surrounding blackness in the way that only wild men and animals understood. He turned, still moving like a shadow, and went stealthily back to his lean-to in his bed. And soon after he slept, the wind changed, and he divined stirred gently in the reflection of the stars within the lake, rising among the far ridges of the country beyond 50 Island water. It came from a direction in which he had stared, and it passed over the sleeping camp with a faint and sighing murmur through the tops of the big trees that was almost too delicate to be audible. With that, down the desert paths of night, though too faint, too high even for the Indian's hair-like nerves, there passed a curious, thin odor, strangely disquieted, an odor that's something that seemed unfamiliar, utterly unknown. The French Canadian and the man of Indian blood each stirred uneasily in his sleep at just about this time, though neither of them woke. And then the ghost of that unforgettable strange odor passed away and was lost among the leagues of tenantless forest beyond. Chapter 2. In the morning, the camp was astir before the sun. There had been a light fall of snow during the night, and the air was sharp. Punk had done his duty bedtimes, for the odors of coffee and fried bacon reached every tent. All were in good spirits. "Wind's shifted," cried Hank vigorously, watching Simpson and his guide already loading the small canoe. "It's across the lake, dead right for you fellers, and the snow'll make bully trails. There's any moose moosing up there. They'll not get so much as a trail and scent of you with the wind as it is. Good luck, Monsieur Defago," he added, facetiously, giving the name its French pronunciation for once. Defago returned the good wishes, apparently in the best of spirits, the silent mood gone. Before 8 o'clock, Punk had the camp to himself. Cathcart and Hank were far along the trail that led westwards, while the canoe that carried Defago and Simpson, with a silk tent and grub for 2 days, was already a dark speck bobbing on the bosom of the lake, going due east. The wintry sharpness of the air was tempered now with the sun that topped the wooded ridges and blazed with a luxurious warmth upon the world of the lake and the forest below. Loons flew, skimming through the sparkling spray that wind lifted. Divers shook their dripping heads to the sun and popped smartly out of sight again. As far as the eye could reach, rose the leagues of endless crowding bush, desolate in its lonely sweep and grandeur, untrodden by foot of man, and stretching its mighty unbroken carpet right up to the frozen shores of the Hudson Bay. Simpson, who saw it all for the first time as he paddled hard in the bows of the dancing canoe, was enchanted by the austerity beauty. His heart drank in the sense of freedom in great spaces, just as his lungs drank in the cool, perfumed wind. Behind him in the stern seat, singing fragments of his native shanties, Defago steered the craft of birch bark like a thing of life, answering cheerfully all of his companions' questions. Both were gay and light-hearted. On such occasions, men lose the superficial, worldly distinctions. They became human beings working together for a common end. Simpson, the employer, and Defago, the employed, among these primitive forces were simply two men, the guider and the guided. Superior knowledge, of course, assumed control. The younger man fell without a second thought into the quasi-subordinate position. He never dreamed of objecting Defago, dropping the Mr. and addressing him as, say, Simpson or Simpson boss, which was invariably the case before they reached the farther shore after a stiff paddle of 12 miles against head wind. He only laughed and liked it, then ceased to notice at all. For this divinity student was a young man of parts and character, though as yet, of course, untraveled, and on this trip, the first time he had seen any country but his own in little Switzerland, the huge scale of things somewhat bewildered him. It was one thing, he realized, to hear about primitive forests, but quite another to see them, while to dwell in them and seek acquaintance with their wild life was, again, an intuition that no intelligent man could undergo without a certain shifting of personal values hitherto held for permanent and sacred. Simpson knew that the first faint indication of this emotion when he held the new .30-03 rifle in his hands and looked along its pair of faultless, gleaming barrels. The 3 days' journey to their headquarters by lake and portage had carried the process a stage farther, and now that he was about to plunge beyond even the fringe of wilderness, where they were camping, to the virgin heart of uninhabited regions as vast as Europe itself, the true nature of the situation stole upon him with the effect of delight and awe that his imagination was fully capable of appreciating. It was himself and Defago against a multitude, at least against a Titan. The bleak splendors of these remote and lonely forests rather overwhelmed him with a sense of his own littleness. That stern quality of tangled backwoods, which could only be described as merciless and terrible, rose out of these far blue woods, swimming upon the horizon, and revealed itself. He understood the silent warning. He realized in his own utter helplessness. Only Defago, as a symbol of distant civilization where man was master, stood between him and a pitiless death by exhaustion and starvation. It was thrilling to him, therefore, to watch Defago churn over the canoe upon the shore, pack the paddles carefully underneath, and then proceed to blaze the spruce stems for some distance on either side of an almost invisible trail, with a careless remark thrown in. "Say, Simpson, if anything happens to me, you'll find the canoe all crept by these marks. Then strike due west into the sun and hit home camp again, see?" It was the most natural thing in the world to say, and he said it without any noticeable inflection of the voice, only it happened to express the youth's emotions at that moment with an utterance that was symbolic of the situation and his own helplessness as a factor in it. He was alone with Defago in a primitive world, that is. The canoe, another symbol of man's ascendancy, was now left behind. Those small yellow patches made on the trees by an axe were the only indications of its hiding place. Meanwhile, shouldering the packs between them, each man carrying his own rifle, they followed the slender trail over the rocks and fallen trunks and across frozen swamps, skirting numerous lakes that fairly gemmed the forest, their borders fringed with mist, and towards 5 o'clock found themselves suddenly on the edge of the woods, looking out across a large sheet of water in front of them, dotted with pine-clad islands of all discernible shapes and sizes. 50 island water," announced Defago wearily. "And the sun just going to dip his bald old head into it," he added with an unconscious poetry, and immediately they set about pitching up the tent for the night. In a very few minutes, under those skillful hands, there never made a movement too much or too little. The silk tent stood taut and cozy, the beds of balsam boughs ready laid, and a brisk cooking fire burned with the minimum of smoke. While the young Scotchman cleaned the fish they had caught trolling behind the canoe, Defago guessed he would just as soon take the turn through the bush for an indications of moose. "May come across the trunk where they been and lay their horns up against," he said as he moved off, "or feedin' on the last of the maple leaves." And he was gone. His small figure melted away like a shadow in the dusk, while Simpson noted that kind of admiration how easily the forest absorbed him into herself. A few steps, it seemed, and he was no longer visible. Yet there was a little underbrush hereabouts. The trees stood somewhat apart, well spaced, and in the clearings grew silver birch and maple, spear-like and slender against the immense stems of spruce and hemlock. But for occasional prostrate monsters and the boulders of gray rock that thrust uncouth shoulders here and there out of the ground, it might have well been a bit of a park in the old country. Almost one might have seen it at the hand of a man. A little to the right, however, began the great burnt section, miles in extent, proclaiming its real character, brûlé, as it was called, where the fires of the previous year had raged for weeks, and blackened stumps now rose gaunt and ugly, bereft of the branches, like gigantic match heads stuck into the ground, savage and desolate beyond words. The perfume of charcoal and rain-soaked ashes still hung faintly about. The dusk rapidly deepened. The glades grew dark. The cackling of the fire and the wash of the little waves along the rocky lake shore were the only sounds audible. The wind had dropped with the sun, and in the vast world of branches nothing stirred. Any moment, it seemed, the woodland gods, who are to be worshipped in silence and loneliness, might stretch their mighty and terrific outlines among the trees. In front, though, the doorways pillared by huge straight stems, lay the stretch of 50 Island Water, a crescent-shaped lake some 15 miles from tip to tip, and perhaps 5 miles across where they were camped. A sky of rose and saffron, more clear than any atmosphere Simpson had ever known, still dropped its pale, streaming fires among the waves, where the islands, 100, surely, rather than 50, floated like fairy barks in some enchanted fleet, fringed with pines, whose crest fingered most delicately by the sky. They almost seemed to move upwards as the light faded, about to weigh anchor and navigate the pathways of the heavens instead of the currents of their native and desolate lake. In strips of colored cloud, like flaunting pennons, signaled their departure to the stars. The beauty of the scene was strangely uplifting. Simpson smoked the fish and burnt his fingers into the bargain in his efforts to enjoy it, and at the same time tended the frying pan and the fire. Yet, ever at the back of his thoughts lay that other aspect of the wilderness, the indifference to human life, the merciless spirit of desolation which took no note for man. The sense of his utter loneliness, now that even Defago had gone, came across as he looked about him and listened for the sound of his companion's returning footsteps. There was a pleasure in the sensation, yet, with a perfectly comprehensible alarm, and instinctively the thought stirred in him. What could I do, if anything happened and he did not come back? They enjoyed their well-earned supper, eating untold quantities of fish and drinking unmilked tea strong enough to kill men who had not covered 30 miles hard going, eating little on the way. And when it was over, they smoked and told stories around the blazing fire, laughing and stretching weary limbs and discussing plans for the morrow. Defago was in excellent spirits, though disappointed at having no signs of moose to report. But it was dark, and he had not gone far. The brûlée, too, was bad. His clothes and hands were smeared with charcoal. Simpson watched him, realizing with renewed vividness their position, alone together in the wilderness. "Defago," he said presently, "these woods, are a bit too big to feel quite at home in. To feel comfortable in, I mean, eh?" He merely gave expression to the mood of the moment. He was hardly prepared for the earnestness, the solemnity even, with which the guide looked at him. "You've hit it right, Simpson boss," he replied, fixing his searching brown eyes on his face. "And that's the truth, sure. There's no end to 'em, no end at all," he then added in a lowered tone, as if only to himself. "There's lots found out that and gone plumb to pieces." But the man's gravity of the manner was not quite to the other's liking. It was a little too suggestive for the scenery and setting. He was sorry he had broached the subject. He remembered suddenly how his uncle had told him that men were sometimes stricken with a strange fever of the wilderness, when the seduction of inhabited wastes caught them so fiercely that they went forth, half fascinated, half diluted, to their death. And he had a shrewd idea that his companion held something in sympathy with that queer type. He led the conversation on to other topics, on to Hank and the doctor, for instance, and the natural rivalry as to who would get the first sight of a moose. "If they went west," observed Defago carelessly, "there's 60 miles between us now, with old Punk at halfway house eatin' himself full to bustin' with fish and coffee." They laughed together over the picture, but the casual mention of those 60 miles again made Samson realize the prodigious scale of this land where they hunted. 60 miles was a mere step, 200 little more than a step. Stories of lost hunters rose presently before his memory, the passion and mystery of homeless and wandering men, seduced by the beauty of green forests, swept his soul in a way too vivid to be quite pleasant. He wondered vaguely whether it was the mood of his companion that invited the unwelcome suggestion with such presticence. "Sing us a song, Defago, if you're not too tired," he asked. "One of those old Voyager songs you sang the other night." He handed his tobacco pouch to the guide and then filled his own pipe, while the Canadian, nothing loth, sent his light voice across the lake in one of those plaintive, almost melancholy shanties with which lumbermen and trappers lessen the burden of their labor. There was an appealing and romantic flavor about it, something that recalled the atmosphere of an old pioneer days when Indians and wilderness were leagued together, battles frequent in the old country farther off than it is today. The sound traveled pleasantly over the water, but the forest at their back seemed to swallow it down with a single gulp that permitted neither echo nor resonance. It was in the middle of the third verse that Simpson noticed something unusual, something that brought his thoughts back with a rush from faraway scenes. A curious change had come into the man's voice. Even before he knew what it was, uneasiness caught him, and looked up quickly. He saw that Defago, though still singing, was peering about him into the bush, as though he heard or saw something. His voice grew fainter, dropped to a hush, and then ceased altogether. The same instant, with a movement amazingly alert, he started to his feet and stood upright, sniffing the air, like a dog scenting game. He drew the air into his nostrils in a short, sharp breath, turning quickly as he did in all directions and finally pointing down the lake shore eastwards. It was a performance unpleasantly suggestive and at the same time singularly dramatic. Simpson's heart disagreeably as he watched him. "Lord, man, how you made me jump!" he exclaimed, on his feet beside him in the same instant, peering over his shoulder into the sea of darkness. "What's up? Are you frightened?" Even before the question was out of his mouth, he knew it was foolish, for any man with a pair of eyes in his head could see that the Canadian had turned white down to his very gills. Not even sunburn and the glare of the fire could hide that. The student felt himself tremble a little, weakish in the knees. "What's up?" he repeated quickly. "Do you smell moose? Or anything wrong?" He lowered his voice instinctively. The forest pressed around them like its encircling wall. The near tree stems gleamed like a bronze in the firelight. Beyond that, blackness, and so far as he could tell, a silence of death. Just behind them, a passing puff of wind lifted a single leaf, looking at it, then laid it softly down without disturbing the rest of the covey. It seemed as if a million invisible causes had combined just to produce the single visible effect. Other life pulsed about them, and it was gone. Defago turned abruptly. The livid hue of his face had turned to a dirty gray. "I never said I heard or smelt nothing," he said slowly and empathetically in an oddly altered voice that conveyed somehow a touch of defiance. "I was only taking a look around, so to speak. It always a mistake to be too previous with your questions." And then he added suddenly with an obvious effort in his more natural voice, "Have you got any matches, Boss Simpson?" and proceeded to light the pipe he had half filled just before he began to sing. Without speaking another word, they sat down again by the fire, Defago changing his side so that he could face the direction the wind came from, for even a tenderfoot could tell that. Defago changed his position in order to hear and smell all there was to be heard and smelt, and since he now faced the lake with his back to the trees, it was evidently nothing in the forest that had sent so strange and sudden warning to his marvelously trained nerves. "Guess now I don't feel like singing any," he explained presently in his own accord. "That song kinda brings back memories that's troublesome to me. I never ought to begin it. It sets me on to imagining things, see." Clearly the man was still fighting with some profoundly moving emotion. He wished to excuse himself in the eyes of the others, but the explanation in that was only in part of truth, was a lie. He knew perfectly well that Simpson was not deceived by it, for nothing could explain away the livid terror that had dropped over his face while he stood there sniffing the air. And nothing, no amount of blazing fire or chatting on ordinary subjects, could make that camp exactly as it had been before. The shadow of an unknown horror, naked if unguessed, that had flashed for an instant in the face and gestures of the guide, had also communicated itself vaguely, and therefore abhorrently, to his companion. The guide's visible efforts to disassemble the truth only made things worse. Moreover, to add to the younger man's uneasiness was the difficulty, nay, the impossibility he felt of asking questions, and also his complete ignorance as to the cause. Indians, wild animals, forest fires, all these he knew were wholly out of the question. His imagination searched vigorously, but in vain. Yet, somehow or other, after another long spell of smoking, talking, and roasting themselves before the great fire, the shadow that had so suddenly invaded their peaceful camp began to shift. Perhaps Defago's efforts, or the return of his quiet and normal attitude, accomplished this. Perhaps Simpson himself had exaggerated the affair out of all proportion to the truth. Or possibly the vigorous air of the wilderness brought its own powers of healing. Whatever the cause, the feeling of immediate horror seemed to have passed away as mysteriously as it had come, for nothing occurred to feed it. Simpson began to feel that he had permitted himself the unreasoning terror of a child. He put down partly to a certain subconscious excitement that this wild and immense scenery generated in his blood, partially to the spell of solitude, and partially to over-fatigue. That pallor in the guide's face was, of course, uncommonly hard to explain, yet it might have been due to some way of effect of the firelight or his imagination. He gave it the benefit of the doubt. He was Scotch. When somewhat ordinary emotion had disappeared, the mind always finds dozens of ways of explaining away its cause. Simpson lit the last of a pipe, tried to laugh to himself. On getting home to Scotland it would make quite a good story. He did not realize that his laughter was a sign that terror still lurked in the recesses of his soul, that, in fact, it was merely one of the conventional signs by which a man seriously alarmed tries to persuade himself that he is not so. Defago, however, heard that low laughter and looked up with surprise on his face. The two men stood, side by side, kicking the embers about before going to bed. It was 10 o'clock, a late hour for hunters to still be awake. "What's tickling yer?" he asked, as ordinary of a tone he could, yet gravely. I was thinking of our little toy woods at home." Just at that moment, stammered Simpson, coming back to what really dominated his mind, and startled by the question. "Compared to them, to all this." He swept his arm around, indicating the bush. A pause followed, in which neither of them said anything. "All the same, I wouldn't laugh about it if I was you," Defago added, looking over Simpson's shoulder into the shadows. "There's places in there nobody won't never see into. Nobody knows what lives in there, either." Too big, too far off? The suggestion in the guide's manner was immense and horrible. Defago nodded. The expression on his face was dark. He, too, felt uneasy. The younger man understood that in hinterland of this size, there might well be depths of the wood that have never been in the life of the world to be known or trodden. The thought was not exactly the sort he welcomed. In a loud voice, cheerfully, he suggested that it was time for bed. But the guide lingered, tinkering by the fire, arranging the stones needlessly, doing dozens of things that didn't really need doing. Evidently, there was something he wanted to say, yet found it difficult to get at. "Say, you boss Simpson," he began suddenly, as the last shower of sparks went into the air. "You don't smell nothing, do you? Nothing particular, I mean?" The commonplace question, Simpson realized, veiled a dreadfully serious thought in his mind. A shiver ran down his back. "Nothing but burning wood," he replied firmly, kicking again the embers. The sound of his own foot made him start. "And all the evening you ain't smelt nothing?" persisted the guide, peering at him through the gloom. "Nothing extraordinary or different to anything else you've ever smelt before?" No, man, nothing at all," he replied aggressively, half angrily. Defago's face cleared. "That's good," he exclaimed with evident relief. "That's good to hear. Have you asked Simpson sharply, and at the same instant regretted the question. The Canadian came closer in the darkness. He shook his head. "I guess not," he said, though without an overwhelming conviction. "Must have just been that song of mine that did it. It's a song that they sing in lumber camps and godforsaken places like that, when they're scared the Wendigo's somewhere around doing a bit of a swift traveling." "And what's a Wendigo, pray?" Simpson asked quickly, irritated because again he could not prevent that sudden shiver of nerves. He knew that he was close upon the man's terror and the cause of it, yet a rushing passionate curiosity overcame his better judgment and his fear. Defago turned swiftly and looked at him as though he were suddenly about to shriek. His eyes shone, but his mouth was wide open. Yet all he said, or whispered rather, for his voice sank very low, was, It nothing, but them's lousy feathers believe there's a hittin' at the bottle for too long, a sort of great animal that lives up yonder." He jerked his head northwards. "Quick as lightnin' in its tracks, and bigger 'n anything else in the bush, and ain't supposed to be very good to look at, that's all." "A backwoods superstition," began Simpson, moving hastily toward the tent in order to shake off the hand of the guide that clutched his arm. Come, hurry up for God's sake, and get the lantern going. It's time we're in bed and asleep if we're going to be up with the sun tomorrow." The guide was close on his heels. "I'm comin'," he answered out of the darkness. "I'm comin'," and after a slight delay he appeared with the lantern and hung it on the nail in front of the pole of the tent. The shadows of 100 trees shifted their place quickly as he did so, and then he stumbled over the ropes, diving swiftly inside. The whole tent trembled as though a gust of wind struck it. The two men lay down without undressing upon their beds of soft balsam boughs, cunningly arranged. Inside was all warm and cozy, but outside the world-crowding trees pressed close about them, marshalling their million shadows and smothering the little tent that stood there like a wee white shell facing the ocean of tremendous forest. Between the two lonely fingers within, however, they pressed another shadow that was not a shadow from the night. It was a shadow cast by a strange fear never wholly exorcised that leaped suddenly upon Defago in the middle of his singing, and Simpson as he lay there watching the darkness through the open flap of the tent, ready to plunge into the fragrant abyss of sleep, knew first that unique, profound stillness of a primeval forest when no wind stirs, and then the night as a weight and substance that enters into the soul to bind a veil about it. And then sleep took him. Chapter 3. Thus it seemed to him, at least, yet it was true that the lap of water just beyond the tent door still beat time with his lessening pulses, when he realized he was laying with his eyes open, and that another sound had recently introduced itself with a cunning softness between the splash and murmur of the waves. And long before he understood what that sound was, it had stirred him in the centers of pity and alarm. He listened intently, though at first in vain, from the running blood beat all drums too noisily in his ears. Did it come? He wondered, from the lake, or from the woods? Then suddenly, with a rush and a flutter of the heart, he knew it was close beside him in the tent, and when he turned over after better hearing, it focused itself unmistakably not 2 feet away. It was a sound of weeping. Defago, upon his bed of branches, was sobbing in the darkness as though his heart would break, the blankets evidently stuffed against his mouth to stifle it. And his first feeling, before he could think or reflect, was a rush of poignant and searching tenderness. This intimate human sound, heard amid the desolation about them, woke pity. It was incongruous, so pitifully incongruous, and so vain. Tears in this vast and cruel wilderness, of what avail? He thought of a little child crying in the mid-Atlantic. Then, of course, with fuller realization and the memory of what had gone before, came the descent of a terror upon him, and his blood ran cold. "Defago," he whispered quickly. "What's the matter?" He tried to make his voice very gentle. "Are you in pain? Unhappy?" There was no reply, but the sound ceased abruptly. He stretched his hand out and touched him. The body did not stir. "Are you awake?" For it occurred to him that the man was crying in his sleep. "Are you cold?" He noticed that his feet, which were uncovered, projected beyond the mouth of the tent. He spread an extra fold of his own blankets over them. The guide had slipped down in his bed, and the branches seemed to have been dragged with him. He was afraid to pull the body back again for the fear of waking him. One or two tentative questions he ventured softly, but though he waited for several minutes, there came no reply, nor any sign of movement. Presently, he heard his regular and quiet breathing, and putting his hand against the gentle breast, felt the steady rise and fall. "Let me know if anything's wrong," he whispered, "or if I can do anything. Wake me up once you feel queer." He hardly knew what to say. He lay down again, thinking and wondering what it all meant. Defago, of course, had been crying in his sleep. Some dream or other afflicted him. Yet never in his life would he forget that pitiful sound of sobbing, and the feeling that the world, awful wilderness, was listening. His own mind busied itself for a long time with recent events, of which this took a mysterious place as one, though his reason successfully argued away any unwelcome suggestions. A sensation of uneasiness remained, resisting ejection, very deep-seated, peculiarly beyond ordinary. Please join us back by the fire again to hear the rest of the story of The Wendigo, created in 1910. And that's the end of tonight's tale by the fire. Thanks for joining me under the moonlight, where the stories come alive and the night listens in. If you felt the magic, howl that love by hitting subscribe, tapping the bell, and sharing the story with your pack. Until next time, stay curious, stay cozy, and keep your ears open. Snaggy Wolf signing off, but the fire never truly goes out.